Good afternoon. I think we're going to try to get started. I'm Ann Valenchik. I'm the Dean of Academic Affairs, and in our governance structure, the executive sponsor of this project. I like the word executive. I think it would please my dad. I wanted to explain we're having a kind of interesting logistical challenge. The architects, Roger Duffy, Colin Koop, Meredith Bostwick, all went to LaGuardia Airport to get on a plane. There was bad weather at LaGuardia, and the plane was going to be delayed. So they made a command decision. They sent Roger Duffy back to the office so that he could participate remotely. Roger, are you there?
I am indeed, and hello everyone.
So that's Roger remotely. Colin and Meredith are in a taxi. They are racing toward us, right? So the plan was that in the event that Colin and Meredith couldn't get here, Roger would do the presentation remotely. But if we can get Colin here in time, then he will do it live and Roger will be here to answer questions. So my job is to take something that we were going to put at the end of the presentation and move it to the beginning and vamp a little bit to fill some time. So by the time I'm done, you'll be tired of hearing from me and anxious to hear from an architect. My goal is just to give you a little bit of an overview of what's happening on all of Science Hill. Those of you, there are many denizens, current and former, of Science Hill, and I know you know what's up there, but there are a lot of other folks who might not. It's not just the Science Center, it's a bunch of other buildings, and there are things happening in all of these places. So the observatory is getting a new telescope, which also means there needs to be a renovation to the dome that telescope is in. Our colleagues in astronomy have marshaled their pennies from the earnings of an endowment they have over many, many years to save up for this scope, so that's pretty exciting. We're also changing some utility service there. Right now, they draw their utilities from Sage. Since Sage isn't going to be there to provide them utility service, they're getting their own. It's called islanding. I didn't know that, but now I do. In the greenhouse side, some of you have noticed that the greenhouses have basically been closed for public access for quite some time. The condition of the greenhouses made it impossible for people to work in there. And over the course of the last year, we moved a lot of the plants out. That's what the big trees in the focus are. There are plants in 2 temporary greenhouses between the observatory and Witten House, and there are a bunch more in storage in the greenhouses on the Honeywell estate. What's going to happen there is we're going to build new teaching and research greenhouses, but we're also going to replace the public greenhouses with a new project called Global Flora. Global Flora is itself a really interesting project that deserves its own presentation, but just so that you understand, it's a greenhouse project organized around the idea of the study of plant form and the way plant form is an adaptation to the environment. It is a greenhouse where the plants are planted in the ground, which is a novelty anywhere, but especially here in New England. It is designed for the monitoring of soil and water conditions, but also to be a place that it is interesting and pleasurable to be, and it has been built to a really high degree of sustainability. We are hoping to be ready to go with that next summer. The L and E wings are getting a substantial renovation on the exterior of L. New exterior glazing, which we think will improve our ability to keep the weather out and the controlled climate inside in. The science library is being converted into a classroom, office, laboratory, study space that we are calling the Data Lab. We're going to be renovating some classrooms in the E-Wing, particularly to convert some physics laboratory rooms to studio rooms that will allow the physics faculty to teach lab and lecture together, which is a new way of teaching physics. And we're converting Orit Sher's current human-computer interaction lab into a horticulture and ecology lab, because her lab is moving to the Data Lab. Sage Hall is going to be torn down, although the walls of Sage that make the focus will remain. And you might have noticed on the gray lot that there's the construction of temporary or modular classrooms. We're trying not to call them trailers. I have been in them and they don't feel trailery. They feel like a not very architecturally interesting elementary school from 1967. which I think they're functional, right? But they're certainly not beautiful, but they're more than functional, and they provide us with flexibility to use them as laboratories in 2018-19, and then to convert them to classes and offices in 1920 and 2021. Pardon? They're here. Great. I was just hearing that they're here. So, just to give you a sense of the project construction plan, right? Over the winter, they built those modular classrooms, right? The observatory mechanical work will begin. And over this summer and into next year, so for the year between now and a year from now, we'll be working on the L-wing renovation, we will be building global flora, and the observatory will get its new telescope. In the summer of 2019, just to give you a sense of the hecticness of it, everything that is currently in the trailers will have to be moved back into L-wing, and then the trailer spaces will be converted from laboratories to classrooms and offices, and then what happens in Sage is going to be decanted into those trailers and to some other swing spaces on campus, and then the work in Sage can begin. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions about the timeline? So I get a lot of questions about whether it's going to be noisy and dirty and unpleasant. It's a construction zone, so it will, to a certain extent, be noisy and dirty and unpleasant. We are doing everything we can to minimize that. We are working closely with our partners from Turner Construction to plan for that, and I am expecting that all of you will feel free to let me know when it is too loud or dirty or whatever. My experience of this community is that people will not be shy about that. And excitement of excitement, here is the man of the hour. I am delighted to be able to introduce to you Colin Koop, who's the lead design architect on this project and just recently became partner at SOM. I just like to brag on people. He'll be leading through a discussion of the design of the building, and our hope is that this will take 40 minutes, and then we will have 20 minutes or so for question and answer. There are microphones at the end of the aisles, and we hope you'll line up there to ask your questions, and then I'll just let Colin have the floor. Just work it from here.
Great. Okay, well, one lesson is other buildings need renovations, like LaGuardia, for example, could use a renovation. It's great to be here. I have to say that up front on behalf of SOM, Roger Duffy, the design partner on this project, and the entire team, we're absolutely thrilled to be able to show what has been almost 2 years of work behind the scenes in close collaboration with many of this community in the Science Center and beyond, trying to imagine what the next generation Science Center will look like at Wellesley College. We want to begin by talking about the landscape. And as we were just driving in, it's always remarkable to come to Wellesley, no matter what time of year it is, because Wellesley is always changing. Wellesley has the benefit of having put the landscape first when they began to think about what this campus should be, so that the architecture is meant to evolve in harmony or in dialogue with that landscape. And today happened to be a beautiful spring day. There's also beautiful snowy days and beautiful fall days on this campus. And we thought a long time about the sort of meditative quality of the experience of moving through the Wellesley landscape. And it begins with those processional paths, which were very much in the spirit of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr.'s letter in 1902, which talked about the importance of preserving the lowlands, the wet meadows on campus, a building architecture on the escarpments, on the sloped hillsides, and preserving the hilltops as sort of improvised quads and community spaces. We find that very inspirational, and we find that to be a very contemporary way of thinking about architecture, which is not seeking to superimpose or force itself upon the landscape, but rather work with it. But we do have the observation that the Science Center occupies a unique place in that dialogue at Wellesley campus, certainly by virtue of its large footprint, but also by virtue of the unique character of the landscape and how the science faculty have used it and are interested in using it. So we thought it might be good to start by just sort of experiencing what it is like today on Science Hill before we talk about what we think it could be like in the future. One of the first things, depending on which direction you approach from, is that you notice a landscape that's much more about active engagement. You see students outdoors, you see them experimenting, you see them trying out new things, and you see them sort of taking their education outdoors. And that's something we want to heighten. We want to turn the landscape into something on Science Hill that is both complementary to that larger vision, but something that allows teaching and learning in science to extend outdoors. There's also the impression that L-Wing gives you. So a true machine in the garden aesthetic, something that was revolutionary at the time. The idea of a building which is also on an escarpment, but the pure scale of that building puts it in a different kind of dialogue with the surrounding landscape. And one of the things that's happened over the years is that landscape has grown up. It has grown in. Trees are much closer to the building when it first opened. So in a sense, particularly on a day like this with the foliage fully in, it is concealed the closer you get to it. And there's certain sort of beauty to that dialogue, but there's also a kind of constriction that comes from that as well. But as you rise up and you approach from the meadow, you come upon this grand staircase. And this is a beautiful cinematic experience to go from the meadow, and the architecture begins to grow around you with the express fire stairs, with the double height space, the compression that pulls you into this. The actual enclosure along this pathway is almost 100 feet in from when the staircase starts. And it is a slow enveloping into this, mid-century brutalist structure. As you enter the building, the first thing that you see is the multi-story space of what is currently the library. And you are looking back at that landscape, but you become increasingly removed from that landscape. And then you, of course, ascend into what is a very remarkable space, the focus. A space which is a dialogue between two eras of science, between two eras of architecture, collegiate Gothic, and that sort of brutalist machine in the garden aesthetic. And that space, in many ways, is meant to simulate you and connect you to the landscape. You see a Wellesley street lamp. You see a blue ceiling. It is also very much a place with potent energy as a community. It is a place that originally was not particularly defined for students. It was actually a space for office and support staff and some meeting space for them. But over time, and particularly with work by Kathy Suma, it's turned into a place that's central to academic life and student life within the campus. And it is very much about all those eras being tied together in a very interesting way. But it is worth observing that this space, which attempts to evoke the natural world, the blue space frame, coloration, evoking a blue sky, it does in many ways separate you from the landscape. And as you progress from this space deeper into the L-wing, some of the challenges become a little more obvious. So you come around corners and you see building support systems which should not be the way they are. You see teaching and learning labs which have no access to natural light and are all interconnected. One super long space which would host several different labs all simultaneously with poor mechanical systems. So it's loud, it's noisy, it is very difficult to teach, and it is, I have yet to find a single science student or science faculty member who has positive things to say about that configuration, which at the time of the building was something that was seen as progressive, but which has increasingly over time become obsolete. There are other areas, this is the support corridor next to that, which can be very disorienting. So we've heard repeatedly, both from visitors and from students and faculty alike, that it is hard to find your way around in the Science Center, very difficult. And even the research lab spaces, although they're on the facade, many of them have no windows. Some of them have actual transparent glass, but many of them have what is called Colwell, which is a plastic material, which is insulating, which allows sort of translucent light in. And it is also a very poor performing facade, it's worth saying, from the standpoint of energy, water infiltration, and many other things that we care about deeply today. The Science Center as a whole is the largest consumer of energy on campus, and it is not even close. and we want to do something about that. But as much as L-Wing has its positive and negative attributes, Sage is a different challenge. It is a building which at the time of the construction of L-Wing, it was seen as a building which it should be begun to be talked about the removal of Sage over time. So the siting of L-Wing was in many ways to facilitate the eventual demolition of Sage. It was acknowledged at the time that it was becoming obsolete, and that has only grown over time. One of the harsh realities of Sage is the floor-to-floor height. So around 11'9", give or take, depending on the floor you're talking about. This is not a modern section for a modern science building. The depth that you need for duct distribution, for structural spans, and other things related to modern contemporary science spaces is significantly higher than this. It's in the range of 14 feet plus. And if you begin to look at trying to renovate this, our initial studies were showing, 7'6" clear. That's a ceiling that I might be able to touch. I'm a tall person, but I might be able to touch that. That's not a space that's appropriate. And you see that in some of these spaces. When on the lowest level of Sage, there are some lights where I have to duck my head in the hallway. That means they're at the 6'3" range. And this is an extremely low building. It does not have good bones for renovation, for contemporary science. And that extends into the teaching spaces where, if you know science, marker boards are at a premium. We've talked at length with professors and students about their desire to see their colleague spaces and their ability to take a marker board, slide it up on the wall, have a second one underneath because they're writing so much during the class. You can't do that in Sage. There's a limited amount of wall space, and the proportions of these spaces are not this. They're not the contemporary multimodal classroom of today. Science learning and teaching has gone under radical changes in the last 20 years with the idea of flipped classrooms, with the idea of not being lectures, but actually being interactive during class time. And the scale of those spaces are much larger to be able to support that kind of teaching, to stay at the cutting edge. And when you begin to look at even placing the smallest increment, this is a 700 square foot room. We have rooms that are 1,600 plus in the program. It becomes nearly impossible because everything that's coded in red is structural, and everything that's structural requires deep structural transfers to remove the columns, which reduces the ceiling height in an already low building. Added to that, estimates that showed to make the mechanical and enclosures work, it became unrealistic to save this building. And so the decision was made to not save this building. But then the question was posed with that decision: how can we create the ideal environment for 21st century science teaching, learning, and research? An aspirational idea. How can we maintain Wellesley's position at the forefront of undergraduate science education and research? And we started in dialogue with Wellesley. So this is a vision statement that came from the faculty. Inviting and sustainable, fluid collaboration, preparing students for leadership, the idea of community. This was a broad idea, but very inspirational to all of us. And from that, and from all of the different stakeholders, came a whole constellation of ideas of what the principles should be. So you see the larger bold ones. Actually, they don't look so bold on the screen, but the ones with the yellow in them. The idea of leveraging landscape and ecology, integration with the landscape. Talk more about that in a second. Transforming the entire hill into a living laboratory. Connecting people to the natural world, being able to see natural light. It's a very small thing, but it's transformational to teaching spaces. A transdisciplinary crossroads, departmental ideals of science. You find a lot of ideas in science happening at the limits of what a department does, at the intersection of what one department does with another. So how can we actually express that in the architecture and facilitate that kind of vibrant exchange? This is an extremely important one. Get the fundamentals right. The performance of the systems in the existing buildings is quite poor. So we need to upgrade those systems, including the enclosure of the L-wing, but also the duct distribution, many of the other systems, fire protection, systems that are essential. If you know anybody in the Science Center, you will know how often the power goes out currently. It's not acceptable for a 21st century science and learning space. This idea of values embodied in the architecture, sustained and enhanced over time. In a long conversation, what that became is something I'll talk about in a second, but what is called a conservation management plan for the L-Wing, which is essentially a framework in which we can manage very sensitively change. The idea of diverse teaching and learning experiences. Not everyone learns or teaches the same. We want to create spaces which are flexible for everyone. And then finally, putting science on display. When you are in the Science Center today, as vibrant a place as the Focus is, you really don't see any of the teaching and learning. You can't see into the labs. You can't see into the research spaces. You have a kind of separation. You pass through a wall to do those things. So how can we do that better? And a part of that also is intuition when you move through the building. How can we make it more intuitive? So I won't dwell on this, but this represents what we in architecture call the program. All of the different spaces that we are required to provide. And this comes through a very comprehensive process with a space programmer who works with the registrar and uses data and an analytical model to develop a projection of the kinds of spaces you would need based on the curriculum that's offered. There's other pieces to this, the idea of the Center for the Environment, which is bringing faculty together from a few different places and putting them in one place, along with some breakout and signature teaching spaces. There's a new research and teaching greenhouse, which will be state-of-the-art. There are new labs for psychology research. There is a new general research lab within the new building. There are common spaces, teaching spaces sprinkled throughout. There is the data lab, which is a concept for co-locating faculty, teaching space, research labs, and student breakout space, all around the theme of people who are working with data in interesting ways. So again, breaking the distinction between departments, starting to find affinities across departments. And then teaching classrooms, things like that. And then finally, the Innovation Hub, which is another concept for how to put interesting resources in one place for science learning. So the idea of a kitchen lab, actually looking at how food is a scientific act, the creation of food. A field sciences lab for people who are working outdoors to come directly indoors. And then there's a new 180-person lecture hall. So I'll talk for a second about both the character of the conservation management plan, what its scope was, and how it became a kind of document that we use. So I talked a little bit about the notion of conservation, the idea that it's a framework for stewardship and appropriate change. It's about enhancement and the long-term survival of the L-Wing, which is a building of significance and a building deserving of survival. And it's about documenting that history of its evolution as a resource for all people to use over time. The categories of why significance is meaningful here is both the role that science has played at women's colleges, in Wellesley in particular, the evolution of undergraduate science pedagogy and the building's representation of that, the history and culture of Wellesley as a whole, the design process and the methodology they used, which was unique at the time, and the architecture itself as a building very much experimental for the time within the architectural world. The scope is everything that's outlined in orange here. So the key line, and one that we'll talk about in a second, is the surface, the inclusion of that surface surrounding the focus. So it is the sage wall, facing focus as well, that is part of what gives the focus its character. You could not remove that collegiate Gothic facade and expect to have preserved the focus. So that became something that was in deep dialogue and became a decision that we would preserve sage all the way up to that wall. That is no small feat, because when you demolish a building and leave a wall in place, there requires a tremendous amount of new structure and new structural bracing in order to enable that to take place. The methodology, and I should pause here, and I didn't do this, that Tom Jester and David Fixler are here, our two conservationists who did the plan, and they'll be able to answer some of the questions later on. But the methodology was first-person interviews, programming and design documents, looking at records, looking at the history from the building and grounds standpoint, the process diagrams that you see an example of here on the right, and photos and an actual field survey of what the existing conditions were. So an exhaustive methodology. And ultimately what comes out of that is a kind of hierarchy, categories of significance in terms of what needs to be most carefully considered when conserving and renovating the building. So examples like this, various components of the enclosure, the focus bridges, the color palette, the sage wall itself. These are all different examples of pieces which contribute to that. So with that introduction, let's talk about what the design approach actually is. So we begin with this diagram, and that appearance, the word that often occurred to people, was talking about the monolithic quality of Science Hill, the appearance of a fortress, the inability to find your way in if you're not a student there. And so we talk about the fact that we're removing these outmoded pieces, Sage Hall as well as the research greenhouses, but preserving the focus and its integrity from Sage Wall, the north and east wall of Sage Wall. And we thought that the new building, first of all, appreciate for the moment the complexity of this edge as something to be up against, meaning that the architecture that we're creating has to be something that sort of sutures all that together into an integral whole. But we also didn't want to just solve that low bar of challenges. We wanted to find a way to make a meaningful and demonstrable example of what science was today. And one of the phrases that had come forward was this idea of a village for science, not a huge platform, not a machine for science, but a village for science. That there would be individual pavilions with different pieces of program that would be sort of scattered and integrated into the landscape. But one of the things that we thought you could do is take that existing spine, that walk that comes up from the meadow that deposits you currently in the focus, and allow the focus to make that connection northward and extend that spine through the middle of those pieces of the village. And in doing so, you have a coherent way of navigating, but you also have this nature of a building which is a machine for science, is that sort of historic legacy facing the meadow, but as you rise up the hill, the scale is broken down so that when you exit at the top near the observatory, you're talking now about a 2-story, more modestly sized building, which gives its sense of character and drives a scale comparison that's much closer to other parts of the campus, not necessarily only the L-wing. So this is an indicative representation of that, of this as a kind of partie, a diagram, an expression of the idea, integrated into this landscape. There are other pieces of this that are outside of us. You have the Global Flora, which is a beautiful building by Kennedy Village, and you have the observatory to the north. You have Witten House. You have a new turnaround that stops cars short, meaning that people now walking from the observatory to the science center will be walking on pedestrian space only. And then that extends down and into the building, bringing you through a space which connects you to landscape, connects you to all these different pieces of the new program, and pulls you fluidly into the focus, which is still that 4-story culmination of a processional path. There is a clarification that comes with entrances. North, east, south, west, 4 entrances. Currently, the only accessible entrance to this building is the loading dock, where you take a ramp past the hazardous materials storage bin. That is not appropriate. So these new entrances all being accessible, so you're creating a more universal experience. There is that sort of diagram of that path weaving its way through the building, and the ability to sort of, like a spine with ribs coming off of it, have these paths that extend off of it into these unique addresses. So what's kind of interesting about this, and you'll see this in the images in a second, is that feeling of walking through the middle is very much trying to be in the spirit of the focus, meaning that it evokes the sense of being outside or between architecture while actually being indoors. But our goal here is to do this a little bit differently. We think it's exciting the way we're doing it, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But there are those connections to the landscape, and we think that adding more of those in this area will make it more of an integrated experience. And then in that middle space, you see them toned in here more as an idea. It's not exactly those seats, but the idea that there are all sorts of types of breakout space now within this building. Students told us frequently it's hard to focus in the focus. It's hard to do homework in the focus. It's hard to be in conversation with 2 other people in the focus. And so these other spaces are scaled much smaller. Some of them are 2 stories, some of them are 1 stories. Some of them are much more like, almost like, you know, the hole in the wall that you can sneak yourself into and get work done in there. Another critical aspect of this is the section. So this is a cross-section through the building. Here you see the L wing with this exterior fire stairs that rise from the meadow, first past the library and into the focus, and the existing sage elevations and the sort of confusing nature of that. And what we are doing is resolving not to have 5 stories anymore, but to have single aligned levels. There's basically 4 major levels with the addition of the small floor of the library, and those telegraph all the way through. So what that means is while we're preserving the ramps, we have to do some alterations to their slopes. Their slopes are non-compliant anyways. They are a dangerous thing to use in a wheelchair, and we are duty-bound to have to evolve that. So we are sensitively looking at ways to adjust that while preserving everything that is currently the ramps. So let's walk through the plans. So kind of bullet, high-level understanding of what the renovation's doing. So a full facade replacement for the L wing, which I'll come to in a second. Infrastructure upgrades in basically every system for the L wing. There will be some select renovations of teaching spaces, a new active learning classroom, new space for geoscience, et cetera. The teaching labs will get their overdue updates. So fume hoods that have been used for far too long will be replaced. The acoustics will be improved greatly, and that single monospace will be partitioned off into individual labs based on the size of an individual class. It will be a great change for people who are teaching in those spaces. And then this idea, there is no real need for the science library anymore. The vast number of those bookshelves have been removed, the volumes taken away. So this idea of the data lab instead inhabiting the location of the library. So we start on the lowest floor, level G. You see the stair coming in and this double height being preserved, that being now taking on what is currently the reading room, let's say, of the library. We'll take on the experience of the data lounge, not dissimilar to what it is today for study and discussion. But in the mezzanine area, where is essentially 2 stories of book shelves, we put the data lab. So let's zoom in on that. So some of these you have are science spaces that are on display. So we will be installing a new makerspace in this building for students to use. We will be putting in a physical sciences lab, which will be glazed and on display for everyone to see as they go by. You will see seminar rooms, you see a hardware lab, and there are some meeting rooms and other elements as well. In addition, one idea that's just taken hold is the idea that L wing would actually have some outdoor space. And the idea of coming out and having a new bridge out, suspended into the treetops, that's called the front porch. And I'll come to that again in a second. On the mezzanine level, you see a bunch of the computing spaces, research spaces, and breakout spaces, as well as a set of faculty offices for faculty members working with data. So there's that idea of the front porch. Coming out under the large overhang of the building, both half under it and half out of it, up in the sort of tops of the treetops, there's been great excitement about the idea of bird watching, of looking at the landscape around you, of being able to teach out there. And we think it'll be a transformative space for people moving past it in the meadow. You actually will see people outside. Another piece of this that we're doing is, if you know the building well, you'll know that these fire stairs bring you to gangways, down a staircase, and deposit you on a dirt slope at a 45-degree angle, which is, as you can imagine, not compliant for fire egress. So we will be adopting those and creating regrading that allows you to come across, walk horizontally in these areas, and then take a new staircase down within the landscape. So preserving all of these pieces you see here, just making them compliant. This is looking from the focus down into the 2-story data lab, data lounge. So this is the current mezzanine. So glazing into that field sciences space, glazing into some of the faculty spaces, glazing into a new makerspace, all of that still preserving the large-scale open space of the data of the library. This space we're excited about. It is, if I go back for a second in the plan, on the lowest level, underneath all these repetitive beams that span across here, is a kind of dark space with some small study cubbies and other elements. And we had this idea of what we called whiteboard alley, which would be the single longest unbroken wall of whiteboard that I have ever seen on any project, running continuously from end to end. A wall which allows students to sort of break out from the classes that are are in the spaces around them, for professors to hold office hours. We think it's actually going to be turning something right now which is very uninspired and not connected at all to nature or to the life of the university, and making it actually a hub for students to come after hours and do work together. On the opposite side, along the glass, you see those sort of pieces of millwork. This is looking into the makerspace, still preserving that view out and open onto the landscape. So we move a floor up from this. This is now level 1. This is the level of the focus. So you're overlooking the Data Lab lounge. Here's the focus. And the heart of what the new building will do, having already talked about the Data Lab, is what we are looking at is calling the Innovation Hub, which is a space dedicated to innovative and new ways to research and teach science. And it includes both the center of the building here and all the breakout spaces, as well as a series of teaching spaces that front that over 2 stories. Also on this floor is the Center for the Environment, which is right at the experimental landscape level, connecting to the research greenhouse, connecting into the E-wing, all sort of connect in a sort of the center of action, trying to put the Center for the Environment in a very foregrounded space so that you understand that as an evolving way of teaching science. This is a diagram now. So we were thinking about how to make a connection to the L-wing. And the reality, one of the benefits of the L-wing is the integration of structure into its architecture, that direct expression of the tectonic qualities. And I said tectonic, Kathy, I'm sorry. She hates when I say tectonic because that means moving things, and I mean things that stand still when you're talking to a geologist. But that expression, which is powerful, is also part of the challenge of renovating that building, frankly. So it makes it very resistant to change. And most contemporary science buildings have very functional and pragmatic framing strategies using steel that allow you to adapt them over time. So for example, you can put a floor box later on in a steel building quite easily. In a thick concrete building, it becomes quite complicated. But we didn't want to lose the quality of structure as integral to the experience of Science Hill. So the idea was those pavilions would be very pragmatically structured in steel, and some of them frankly have to be. To hold up the sage wall, they have to be structured in steel. But then the middle of the building be some new kind of structure, a timber structure, an actual structural timber piece of the building that would scale over 4 stories and be that connective tissue in between. So when you exit the focus, you enter this new kinds of space, which merges structure, landscape, and these sort of breakout spaces all into one experience. We think this is really exciting. We think the idea of seeing that structure, the quality of the tectonic, but also the way in which those beams both evoke the L-wing, but are something different and something new. Here you see those various pavilions, or the village as we were talking about it, that idea of walking between them. But a big distinction that we would draw between what was done for the L-wing is the ability to look into the spaces. So a generous glazed opening that merges exhibition in the form of a vitrine, as well as views into those new research wings. As well as right next to that, double height, glazed, strong openings out into that landscape, which is its own form of experimental space, with students being able to work right next to the landscape as opposed to removed from it. That space is 2 stories. So on the second floor, so if I go back and I highlight that, you see, bridges coming across. Up above there is actually the level of the observatory, where the front door, the northern entrance to the building would be. So you'd be moving through this space and graciously rising up at that point. So on that floor, you have more of the Innovation Hub, that kitchen lab, the field sciences lab, a wet lab for general use, as well as a new space for psychology focused around family and child research. And that is important to be near the front door because oftentimes there are subjects coming in and they need to be able to drop off, come into the building discreetly and quickly without moving through a big science building and intimidating small children. So that's the logic for that location there. You'll notice that the offices are these 2 pavilions, and they stack up over 4 stories. So if you look at the diagram of the plan, those are basically all of the faculty offices. There are some in E-wing as well, but they are always at the center of the plan, faculty at the center of the Science Center. So this is rising up 1 floor. This would be looking out the front door. We'll go outside in a second and see what this looks like. But again, those connections to landscape, the center for family, Community and Family Research Center, and other pieces right on display. Above that, level 3, rising up further, still the wood structure in the middle. You see a whole constellation of classroom spaces, the entirety of this being lab upgrades across the L wing, so a huge amount of area being renovated and made to work much better and more strongly. Instrumentation spaces being upgraded, renovations within E-wings to make better classrooms for physics. And then an interesting idea to take 2 more of the psychology research spaces and put them next to neuroscience labs. There's real dialogues going on right now between neuroscience and psychology. So having those spaces proximate to each other is a really opportune way to encourage those dialogues. And then finally, the 4th floor. So those who know the building well, there's not much up here currently in L Wing. There is a single bridge. There is a SAD office that paradoxically is the head of the Science Center's office, and not much else. And so having that level, but then now connecting it to offices and a space dedicated for math colloquium room, as well as computing classrooms and traditional active learning classrooms, all together on the top floor of the building. And then connecting out, because the building has terraced down here, the entire roof being open for research. So a big challenge when you are researching, you want to plant 4 or 5 different species or mixes of meadow and see how they do, is that deer come and eat your experiment. And so the idea of being able to do that planting on the rooftop and use the rooftop of the building as an experiment, a much more controlled environment, is really attractive, as you can imagine, to biologists and others in the building. So some of the details that are about this design that come when you think about it in terms of renovation and conservation. There was a conditions assessment done of the exterior of the L wing. The photos on some level speak for themselves. There's significant deterioration. Large portions of the cow wall are encrusted with very dangerous mold. There's portions of the building that have been overgrown with landscape, which eventually begins to claw away at the building. There's corrosion. A significant number of the joints of the existing have literally rusted all the way through. They're not savable. And then you see a lot of this. Chunks of concrete have fallen off over time, so the degradation of the structure. And thermal bridging, which is what we say when you have a piece of metal which is exposed to both the outside and the inside. And in the winter, that metal freezes and brings the cold into the building, and in the summer, vice versa. It becomes very difficult to control the interior environment, so you have to over-temper the environment. You have to spend more energy tempering the environment. So coming up with a thermally bridged mullion was a critical detail to reduce the energy consumption of the building. There were other things that we did, though. You look at the microscopic color analysis that was done. The colors that we all know today are not necessarily the colors, right? So establishing real Pantone swatches based on that color analysis of what the actual original colors were was a painstaking process to find what those were. You look at the mullions and you look at the building in general, and there's this sense of layering. So you have the fire stairs, which are just barely shown in this image. You have the railings and the gangways of the fire pathways. You have the column, the rafters sticking out underneath the primary girder beams that are supported by the structure, all of which pulls in. And then interlaid within that is this kit of parts approach to the exterior wall. Kit of parts meaning that they have a primary steel mullion, and then supporting frames are glazed in between those. And some of those are glass, and some of those are Kawal, and there's an intentional sort of mix of those across the building. So looking at how to replace that meant actually replicating that look. So we don't have to do this kind of technique anymore, and in fact, it's actually not effective to do that kind of technique of a supporting mullion and glazing in between it, because that is the steel mullion that allows that thermal bridging to occur. So, but instead, what we're going to do is replicate the sight lines of this using aluminum, which allows us to bridge and break that thermal barrier. So the look of the orange inlaid between vertical blue members, we will replicate, not the problems of it. The glass was its own study. So a frank discussion with the biologists about their concern about bird impacts on this building, of which there are many. And one of the worst ways to design a building, if you are concerned about that, is to make mirrored glass. So the decision not to just purely replicate a mirrored glass, but to go with a glass that has some degree of that, but it is a higher degree of what we call visible light transmittance. More light will get into the building, but actually less heat gain. So the new higher performing double glazed with what we call low E coating glazing will significantly improve the performance of the building, but it will also look a little more transparent, a little less mirror finish than what it did before. We also took a long look at cow wall. We looked at it a lot of different ways. It's still a material that's used in building today. It is a flammable material, and that is a great concern to us. And as environmentalists, a plastic material, frankly, is also a great concern to us. There are portions of this building in their existing condition that are non-compliant and were likely not compliant when they were built, meaning that there was too much flammable material on the outside of the building. And after looking at this a long time and looking at various ways of doing this, we elected to use a translucent glass insulated glaze unit, which you see an example of here, to replicate the experience of that, though not the actual material. We also decided to set a rule for ourselves that every research lab gets at least one transparent light. We can't have a research lab that has no transparent windows. Finally, the most critical part from a flammability standpoint was the penthouse where all the machinery was. And after looking at that carefully, we elected to replace the cow wall with a metal panel. The other critical part to talk about here is the focus. And we believe strongly in the power of the focus and the desire to have the focus maintain its role and the experience of those eras all coming together in one place. So when you look at all of the parts of the focus, you look at the sage wall first and foremost, and that will be preserved. There will be adaptations to make. We can't have it open. The new addition has to have a glazed separation, so there are details that we're going into there. But the Gothic arches, the brickwork, that is all being preserved. You have some of the idiosyncrasies that actually give it its charm. So those Wellesley lights, lampposts, you have the one-story circular staircase, elements of the concrete language pushing in. This was originally part of the building, as well as these spiraling ramps that connecting you to other levels, and obviously the large-scale ramps itself. All of those we're looking at conserving. In the case of things like the ramp, as I talked about before, there will be adjustments to the pitch of those in acknowledgement of the new floor heights of the new building as well as the building codes. But that brings us to one of the questions which we spent a lot of time thinking about. So how do we connect our innovation hub, our new building, in a way that is unmistakably blending the new and old together? And we were looking at the idea that this corridor is an extension of the exterior path and the sort of purpose of that. And the idea that you need to make a strong and meaningful connection between the new and old. That was one of the primary goals that we set for this. And this idea that the focus at elevation 146.9, connecting directly to the innovation hub and all the surrounding pieces like that, this is the primary floor of the building. This is the most energized floor of the building, and there will be large sums of people moving around. If you have a 200-person lecture that lets out, how do you let people move fluidly through the building? If a 60-person class lets out, how do you let people move fluid through the building? And we looked at this 6 ways from Sunday, and ultimately our decision was that in consultation with Wellesley and the Conservation Management Plan team was to recommend the removal of the existing sage stair, instead having a large-scale opening that connects those two pieces of the buildings together and actually makes that meaningful connection. This is not finalized, the scale of the opening and how it would be built into the sage wall, but the idea of that connection has been powerful and has been meaningful, and we felt that it was important to the ideas of the building that there is a real connection between those two parts, the innovation hub, the new building, and the existing building. If we look at the building from the outside in, if you look at it from above, you have that sense of the super building, the monolith, the machine in the garden with its fire stairs projecting out. You have the E-wing, you have the focus. And then you have our village to the north. And that begins to scale down from 4 stories to 3 stories to 2 stories as it moves northward towards the observatory. And there's a reason for this, which is that the observatory has its own scientific problem. Sage, for a long time, has been a huge problem for those teaching and learning in the observatory. There's a lot of light leakage, and that building is large, and it blocks a significant portion of the night sky. So finding a building that actually improves those conditions with automatic blinds that would deploy in the evening means that their science research would be strongly improved. There's also the sense of what the materiality of this is, and this is still in process, but we are looking at a building which the rest of this is glass and concrete and metal, and we want to keep in that palette. But we have this idea of a metal that might be softer, might be thinner gauge, might be a little bit more in the realm of what you see here, silvery, but would actually age gracefully over time, and we're going to continue the selection of that. But when you look at what the renderings look like, so this is coming from the observatory, you have the diagram of the building in your head before you arrive there. You see the various the two buildings of the two pavilions that you would see, and then you see peeking out in the middle this thing that's just beckoning you into it, this wooden structure where the actual run of the rafters are almost implying how you move through the space. One of the interesting things for us as architects was that there's so many different kinds of teaching spaces in these buildings that the idea of floating the openings, the windows, and gives it a kind of character that we think is a little bit new and interesting for this portion of the campus where everything is much more gridded and strict. So we like that idea of evoking, even in the openings, the idea of kind of playfulness or more village and domestic-like. This is coming from the east, so you see that living laboratory, that outdoor landscape, which will be very active in front of you. But again, this idea of you knowing where the center of the building is, you know how to move through the building. Here's the faculty offices, all faculty offices now facing out into either the focus or into the outside world and getting natural light. That is a true transformation for science educators. The idea that we could evoke in our fire stairs the L-wing, but actually make them usable. You can't use those fire stairs in the L-wing unless there's a fire. So these are real, true communicating stairs that connect you through the building, and a new entrance here dedicated for the Center for the Environment. And I'll end with the landscape design on behalf of MVVA, Michael van Valkenburg Associates, our great landscape architect. A lot of ideas, but it distilled down this idea that it's fundamentally sustainable. You don't create a landscape which requires a lot of water, for example. A landscape which facilitates research. So that means engaging in it, but also being able to observe it. And then trying to find a way to use landscape to unify a lot of unique site conditions. You have the botanic gardens around you. You have different eras of intervention in the landscape around you. We're also in a sensitive wellhead area, so the porosity of that landscape is critically important. How do you do that together? So we looked at this plan earlier, but much of it is about making connections, allow you to sort of ambulate slowly and gently through the landscape, but also bring you to your natural destinations at those entrances. And the idea is to build a diverse planting strategy and have these different kinds of landscapes, so defined by the actual conditions. There is the existing condition of that dirt hill under the shade garden, but perhaps this whole area is moss or some other piece of shady landscape. What we call transect gardens, which take you from over a 60-foot elevation change and bring you through actually many different kinds of landscapes. So the choice to walk this pathway is a choice of actually sort of bisecting your way through a series of different landscape experiences, something that's different than what you have anywhere else at Wellesley. The idea of tying into the woodlands here with a new entrance landscape, and then these successional meadows. So both in that location as well as a hilltop meadow is something that we don't really see here, which is a dry meadow here on the campus. And how do you integrate those into the landscape? With that last piece highlighted here as those sort of really experimental pieces to the landscape. So I've given you a lot. There's a lot of information. And I'll pause here, I'll end here and say, it has been an absolute privilege for us to work with this community. I have never met such an inquisitive, motivated, and sort of compelling community that challenges our assumptions and always is pushing us to do something more interesting. It has been a pure joy, and it's really exciting for us to be able to show these to people for the first time, and we welcome your questions. Thank you.
So if there are microphones, if you wanted to come to the microphone and ask the questions, that'll work.
Mary Coyne, faculty emerita. In the science laboratories, you mentioned that they were dark and there was no light coming in or opening to the outside, and I wondered how you solved that. Is it better?
So it's a good question. We did, and the honest answer is for the existing labs in the L wing, we have not solved that. We looked at replacing the walls that face the focus with glazing or windows of some kind, and I think that hopefully that will be a future project in those areas. What we focused on was the teaching and learning experience in those existing labs relative to noise, vibration, fumes, equipment and machinery, as well as the configuration of the labs. So we hope very much that in those L-wing labs, those 2 floors, that there will be that next step where they're fully connected now to the focus and allow for daylight harvesting from the focus. But I will say in the new building, every one of those labs has natural light coming into them.
It has natural light coming in?
All of the labs in the new building have natural light coming into them.
Oh, in the new building?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the design on the back of the building because I know that light pollution from the Science Center has been a big
Sorry,
problem with the observatory, light pollution in the observatory. So how is the design going to work with that?
How's it dealing with the light
Yeah.
pollution issue? Yeah, so the basic, if I jump back to that rendering real quick. So the simple answer is you attack it in many different ways. So one of them is we brought down the scale of the building. You were looking at a 5-story building, now you're looking at a 2-story building. The second is we reduced the amount of glazing. So even with this amount of glazing here, that plus these more modest windows is far less glazing than currently faces the observatory. There's also, frankly, the biggest challenge for the observatory is the Wellesley lamps. And if you go up there, you will notice that several of them have been blacked out facing the observatory. High glare illuminated lights, as opposed to ones which push light down to the surface of the ground, those are not as good. So we are going to push all of the exterior light down to the ground. And then in the evenings, these windows will have shades that deploy, so that light leakage will be controlled. It's currently basically a kind of honor system. So we're trying to find a way where the building takes charge of that problem. Yeah.
Thank you.
Dorothea Woodmeyer. I have one question and then a comment. The question really is, how did you get the faculty to agree to have their offices separated from the labs? We had a terrible time as we went through the building of the science, what I call the Science Center, because people wanted their labs and their offices together. I see you have not. Either they've changed or you've convinced them.
Do either of you want to take that, or?
It's just a curiosity.
No, absolutely. It's a great question.
What was more important in our conversations with the faculty was that their offices could be adjacent to each other departmentally in a way that had not been part of the original ethos of the Science Center. And the offices, because of the way the building is, are closer to the labs than offices with remote Sage are now, right? But of the things we heard, I want my office next to my L-wing lab was not probably as much of an issue as it had been at the time that you were building the building.
The other comment has to do with the focus. And I realized that over time, the function of the focus changed, and it became very much a student meeting place. I see on the diagram that what was my office has become the what do you call it? The
Leaky beaker?
Yes.
The cafe, yeah.
Right. But initially, in terms of the focus, before this building, the sciences were scattered all over the campus.
Right.
And so part of the concept of the focus was to bring the departments together. And so at the time that it was an administrative place, it served that purpose. And I think it would be too bad if that idea got lost in terms of the telling of the tale. I have no objection to the change in time, but I do hope that that concept doesn't get lost, because it was terribly important in terms of when we designed the Science Center before.
Yeah, no, understood. And it's something that I probably glazed over a little bit in this presentation, but absolutely the idea that you brought people from other parts of the campus to, for the first time, being in one place together, and that was being transformative. If anything, we want to deepen that. So we appreciate the first-person story.
My name is Peter Ferguson. I'm a resident of the town of Wellesley and a former faculty member of the college. There's a lot that you've given us to think about for the first time. And the 20 minutes that we have to digest the very rich offerings are very meager, if I might make that comment. But there's much that I admire in what I've seen this afternoon. I have two observations and one question. The first observation is that I heard nothing at all in terms of appreciation of either Sage or the 1977 building. No sort of sense that these were important buildings in their own time. And the second observation is that I heard, maybe I dozed off, nothing about women and science. Some of your diagrams show men in the building, which may indeed be the future for the sciences at Wellesley. But it seems to me that the work of the social sciences and the humanities, and I can't speak for the natural or physical sciences, has been to try to understand what women's role is in the question of education and in the professions. So I would certainly appreciate hearing a little bit more about that. My one question has to do with the Sage Stair. That is over. The trustees have twice voted to demolish the stair. So I'm not going to comment on that, but I am going to ask the question of has there been any thought given to the notion of reusing one of Sage Hall's large entry doorways as the entry portal into your new village buildings? The post and lintel drawing that you showed seems to me to jar against the rest of the Sage wall. And I can't believe that when Sage is demolished, that it will simply be smashed down with a big wrecking ball. They may tell you that, but they will be busy, the wreckers, saving bits, particularly the decorative bits, which they can sell on to other customers. Is it possible to reuse one of the monumental, many molding doorways as your entryway into the village?
Can I take those in order? So I certainly didn't mean to imply no respect for either Sage or L-Wing. And hopefully, when we walked through the existing conditions and talked about the experience of L-Wing, the ultimately the culmination in Sage, I hope that our admiration for what the generations of builders and educators have achieved in these spaces was communicated, because we understand very much that Wellesley, both as a women's college, but also as a place which has supported ambitious architecture since its inception, that those are twin legacies that we take very seriously. It was not easy to look at Sage and make the decision that it should be demolished. It was something that we spent a great deal of time on, and the amount of effort is not represented in the 4 slides, that I had the time to show you today. But it was a building that is challenging, and one of the greatest challenges was that they did science research in that building in ways that aren't, by today's standards, safe. So part of the demolition of that building will involve removing physical things which are hazardous. The question of what to do about salvaging and reusing pieces, we have talked about that. There's been a discussion about saving the Sage Stair, for example, and potentially using it elsewhere. There are portions of other pieces that have been under discussion. We haven't talked yet about the idea of saving a portal and putting it in that location. I presume you meant the connection between the existing building and the new building as a location. That hasn't been something yet that, I will be honest, that we've studied yet. But it's certainly something that we can go back to the core project team and discuss the merits or not of what to do about that. So.
Again, I'm in America. We seem to be the only ones speaking. I wonder, I suspect you're aware there's a petition online to save the stone stairway.
Yeah.
And I wonder why it couldn't be left there simply as a declaration if for no other reason.
I mean, the biggest challenge for us was that because of the way that the wall is being supported by vertical braced frames at regular increments behind the wall, invisible behind the wall, it restricts the ability to make any sort of large-scale openings. And we examined all of the openings in the immediate area around the stair. Most of them are between 24 to 48 inches wide. And there was a desire on our part to find a way to make a much more forceful, fluid, and intuitive connection. We had, I think, 5 or 6 variations that we studied over time. And after reviewing those, and I think that elevational shot that I showed, where you would rise up and I think intuitively believe you've reached the finish point of your path, versus an opening that was at a scale large enough to make it clear that no, there was a much greater portion of this building, this campus ahead of you. And it was not an easy decision, and we looked at it carefully, but I do believe that we have made the right decision.
Hi, I'm Alice Friedman from the Art Department. Can everybody hear me? Thank you very much for the presentation. And I agree with Peter, there's a great deal to think about. One comment would be that it would be very helpful to have the presentation available online for study and conversation by the community at large.
Alice, it's being recorded, and we'll have the slides, and we're just going to work with Public Affairs and Resources to figure out how to make it accessible to people.
I think that would be very, very helpful. So you can see what is planned, and also the complexity of the program that you outlined. I mean, for me, as many of you know, we had a walkthrough of the Focus yesterday, 2 days ago. And I guess, which is very helpful, and it's not a time of the year where that many people can come to such an event and focus on what about the Focus is being attained and what's going to be lost. One of the things that did surprise me, and I wonder if you would comment on it, is the evisceration of the space by removal of the specimens. And I know the specimens present a problem in their current state because of their toxic stuffing, but it was quite shocking to me to see the pedestals that were designed to go across, beyond those beams that you talked about in the new whiteboard alley underneath that. But if those are going to be removed, if those pedestals are going to be removed, that's a significant alteration. And if there are no specimens in that space, I believe as a historian that some of the richness of the symbolic program and the historical dialogues that you allude to, and I agree that they're very significant, will be lost. In a way, it adds insult to injury, quite literally, not just to the building, but to our history as a college, to remove. I understand the justification, as Peter Ferguson said, it's a done deal. I don't agree with it, but game over, I think, on that front. I think that people need to respond to the student and alum concern about that, but the additional step of taking away those specimens, I think, undermines your very strong advocacy for what you see as the historical center.
Yeah, I mean, to address, you're talking about, essentially the collection of bird specimens and other pieces that are on these podiums, and other animals, but particularly the birds. Yeah, and I appreciate that feels like a piece of history removed. Again, I go back to that slide that had all of the goals on the campus for what the Science Center should be. And one of those was a healthier environment for the people using the building. And those specimens were coated in lead and incredibly dangerous for people to touch. They were at a remove, but they were sitting there. And the challenge was what to do about that, and I think the decision was made to remove them. Now, the pedestals aren't going to be removed, and I think there is a question about how to use the notion of science on display and exhibition in that space. And so I think we can talk about different opportunities to do that. But I will also be honest and say that the decision that I'm describing, which is one, again, that I think we support, was one that was done in direct consultation with the Science Center faculty as well as the facilities group about those specimens.
The only thing I would say in response to that is, well, there are two things. One is surely in this day and age of 3D printing or whatever, you could put adequate facsimiles that were healthy in that space. But also, and this is not, the governance issues are not your concern, but as you say, kind of consultation with the core project team and Science Center faculty, I think it's important for the college to recognize that our institution has a very strong commitment to historical memory, and as you say, to putting not science on display, but also to putting the history of science on display. And when Peter mentioned, the role of women in science, we're also talking about the history of women in science. And I just want to once again put in a pitch for a more vibrant, complex narrative, and not just a token, a tokenism, and not just leaving those pedestals. I mean, it could be quite cool if you've got people down in that ditch with the whiteboards to look up and see birds, for example. I would just like to remind my colleagues on this campus that complexity of thinking, not just the formal thinking and all the wonderful things you said, but the complexity that other members of the community might be able to advocate for would be very much desirable on our campus with its rich traditions.
Understood. And I should note that we're not done with the design process yet. And one of the things that we have been in deep discussion with the science faculty and Kathy in particular, is how to use this building as a way of exhibiting both the history of science at Wellesley, the history of women in science, as well as contemporary research that's going on. And so we have much more to do on that. I will openly acknowledge that that is something that we have, that's the next layer of information, of design thinking that has to go into this. So completely understood.
started off in Freeman Hall, so near to the Science Center, and I just sort of have to say, I'm blown away and really enthusiastic about this, and think of my daughter wants to be a vet, and I'm kind of like, it'd be so amazing if she came to this Science Center. So I'm impressed, I'm amazed.
Thank you.
For what it's worth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Colin, for racing up here against all odds. And thanks to everybody else for being here at this insane time of the year. As I said to Alice, our colleagues in resources asked us to record the presentation, so that has happened. We will get the slides, and I'm going to work with the resources people and with public affairs to figure out where it would be convenient to post this material so that people can continue to have access to it. Colin is not done with his relationship with us, so if you have ongoing questions, you can send them to him through me, and I'd be happy to continue that dialogue. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.